welcome back to the Horror Academic, another Sci-Fi Academic episode for you today. And like last time, we're going to continue our look at the Matrix Trilogy. So just to remind you guys, the edition that I'm talking about is the UK box set of the trilogy, the official Warner Brothers release of the trilogy, which was at the time, which I believe I bought this in 2019, was out of print in America. I guess because they were working on the 4K edition that is now available everywhere. But this is the Blu-ray edition from the UK. So last time we talked about the original, the classic, the near perfect. No, you know what? Screw it. The perfect film, The Matrix. The original is still, holds up better than most films will decades later. The 1999 classic. So that was last week. Go back, watch that episode if you can get a chance yet. So what we're going to do today is we're going to continue the look at the trilogy, but we're going to look at both 2 and 3. And there's a reason for that. It's not just because they're sequels and I don't have as much to say about them as I do as the original, or I don't like them as much as the original, all of which are true, but because they are essentially one film. And let me explain that. So 2 and 3, Reloaded and Revolutions. What I didn't know until watching all of the documentaries on these discs was that the Wachowskis, when they brought it to Warner Brothers, and they brought it to Village Roadshow, was the actual production company who put them together, they pitched it as a trilogy. I was never aware of that. I always thought it was a one and done, and it was like, oh wow, that was like the most successful film of the year, so we need to do more of them. But actually they had it in mind from the whole time as a trilogy, which was interesting to me. What I did know was that they shot them at the same time. So they went into production on 2 and 3 simultaneously so that they could both come out. I believe they came out within 6 months of each other. I know I saw them both in the theater at the time. So a couple of facts. The original Matrix was in 1999. Both of the sequels come out in 2003. So we're still working in Australia, but now everything has just gotten exponentially bigger because they had this massive success on their hand, which was not expected. It was a risk to make the first film. And when it did so well and become like instantly pop culture referenced and iconic imagery, it was like, okay, well, we can definitely greenlight part 2 and 3. So because they wanted it to come out so close together, they shot them at the same time. What I also learned in this process of all of these behind the scenes was like hours and hours of behind the scenes on each of these discs, is that they also at the same time shot all the footage for the video game that came out at the time, which I believe the first game was Enter the Matrix, so that must be the one that they're talking about. Parts of what becomes the Matrix Online, which comes out a few years later, which is a online MMORPG, and the Animatrix, which if you haven't seen, I thought I had a copy of it. The Animatrix, I do recommend. What it is a series of shorts that are kind of within the world of the Matrix. But they're all very much Japanese anime style, by, in most cases, anime writers. So I do highly recommend, if you're into the Matrix and you're like me, you're just going through, re-going through the, the trilogy with the 4th movie just coming out, I would say that's worth picking up. I don't think the video games are going to stand the test of time as well. I do know that the sequel to Enter the Matrix was The Path of Neo. These are both PlayStation 2 era games. They're very boxy looking now. From what I remember from the time, they weren't rated very well and tended to be glitchy. The MMORPG, which I believe launched, I think it was supposed to launch in 04, launches 06, I believe, and is offline. It was apparently had lots of server issues and problems, and yeah, it didn't work out. So that's the video game side. So knowing that at the same time that they're filming these 2 movies on the same, sound stages, the entire complex that is their studio in Australia, they're also shooting all the footage needed for the first video game, what starts to become the online game, and anything that was going to be for the anime as well. So there's a lot going on here at once, which is pretty intense. It becomes its own little mini industry, like its own little Hollywood in Sydney. They have hundreds of people working on these different technical crews. We've gone from where the first film brings us bullet time technology. Now we're working on motion capture technology, and hadn't really realized that they are like one of the things that pushes mocap into the world of filmmaking. What I also found interesting is that this version of motion capture, so motion capture, for those of you that don't know, and I will refer to it as mocap because I think that's how most of us know it now. Motion capture is where you have a green screen environment and your actor is suited up as well in something that can pick up sensors for the computer imaging, and so it creates, using a real body, it creates digital points that can then be animated. But the animation is based on these real natural movements that people are making. So mocap is very popular in video games, but also know that mocap is how the Lord of the Rings films are very possible. Mocap is, you know, it's just a part of life now. So it's really interesting to hear that, you know, a lot of that technology was pushed in the making of the two Matrix sequels. What they also discuss is the idea of emotion capture, which is, you know, your mocap, you have, you know, the suited up actor with, you know, in a lot of cases, we're still talking about the period of using like the little ping pong balls, all of them that are the anchor points for the computers to pick up. But then we're doing an entire set of reaction shots, and that is the actor is strapped essentially to a chair, and cameras, where bullet time was 120 cameras going around, still cameras, a room of essential camera points digitally. This is now 6 cameras across that are all directly on the actor's face. And it is so that you can then impose that image of the actor reacting directly onto that mocap of their body movements. So it's kind of taking the digital and as much you can of the real. So that is really kind of the story of the Matrix movies, is pushing technology to its limits at the time and like pushing it further than anything else had, but still trying to find a way to use human actions to create all of it. Which I'm surprised by looking at it now, as far as the sequels, how much of it feels like straight CG, like no people involved CG that I'm used to today from video games predominantly. But looking at the behind the scenes, they are actually going through all of those motions to create characters that are based on these real actors moving. So it's stuntmen, it's you know, it's wire tricks, it's all of the things that we've seen before, but now it's got this digital layer that's so much more complex and like thicker, I'm gonna say, as a layer than it was in the first Matrix, to the point that looking at it now, I don't feel these movies age as well. I don't know if it's because mocap kind of like transitions quickly into something that we're very familiar with, and this is so early in its infancy that it's clunky looking now. I mean, there's so many points where it's like, that's not even a person, you know, that's ragdoll technology you see in all games, you know. But then to see that they really did capture this, using all of these crazy techniques, it was really surprising to me to see how much of it, no, wait, we really did shoot a real person, but the way the CG worked at the time still makes it look unreal, which is unfortunate. I would love to say that these movies stand the test of time just as well as the original, but I can't say that. Particularly the second film. So the second film picks up where the first one leaves off, but now we see Zion, so we know that it's not just the Nebuchadnezzar. It's not just the one ship of people who are kind of like the renegades who understand that they, you know, that they made it out of the Matrix. It's really, you know, a planet of people. And the city of Zion is where all of these... I mean, I didn't wear a Star Wars shirt for nothing. It feels like the Rebel Alliance once you get there. You really get this sense of, you know, it's an ancient place. It's hundreds of years have passed. The world that they live in is very worn and lived in. And I enjoyed seeing Zion. I enjoyed seeing that there's all these other people who are part of the fight. It's not just, you know, Morpheus and his crew. So that's cool. And it becomes this whole, well, this is it. We got to bear down for the final struggle to save ourselves from the machines, right? And it really is. It's like where many people say The Empire Strikes Back is the greatest of the Star Wars original trilogy. I don't say that, but most people do. I'm going to go on a limb and say it's the opposite in The Matrix, where the middle is a middle. This might be a very unpopular opinion, but I'm going to personally say that Matrix Reloaded is my least favorite of the trilogy. And let me explain why. This is a film that is 60% action sequences. And you're like, oh, but that's cool because the action sequences were so amazing in the original and we just want to see more of that and blah, blah, blah. And you know what? No. I need more than just, we can do these crazy things, so let's do them in an action scene. There's a car chase that is, yes, it is an immense car chase. It is, an extreme feat that they were able to pull off this car chase on a real freeway with all these digital scenes going on, using all of the new tech that they have and blah, blah, blah. It's like 15 or 20 minutes long. I don't care anymore. I got bored. There's another sequence that they call the Burly Brawl and all of the extras, the way it's kind of plotted out in the script. And it's essentially Neo alone versus hundreds of agents. And that's where I start to see the digitalness of this video game look, and it loses humanity to me, because it's so far flung and it's so, again, long. I mean, it's an interesting idea. I mean, it could be a cool, fun idea. I just don't think I need a 10-minute fight scene or 15 or 20 or whatever it is. I started losing interest. So you go from one kind of set piece for over intense fight scene to another set piece for an over intense fight scene. One sequence I did enjoy that was a fight scene, though, was early on, right before that actually, when we go back to the Oracle. So Neo is he's very determined that he will, now that he knows something, he needs to go back to the Oracle to find out what he needs to do now. And on his path to the Oracle, he has to go through her keeper, her guardian. And that guardian, he meets in a traditional looking tea house, and he challenges him to make sure Neo is, all he says he is. So that fight sequence I enjoyed, because to me that harkened back to the initial fight scene where Neo has just learned Kung Fu and he must train with Morpheus. So it had this kind of calling back to the original, which I appreciated. And then from there we go on to the Oracle. But we learn more from the Oracle. We learn that it is bigger than what Neo knows. He has to have more faith than what he has kind of gotten to. And he must have more faith in himself and what his abilities are. So I honestly can say it. I was all in, all the way up to the Oracle scene, and was like, wow, this is cool. I want more of what's going to happen, how he's going to get there. And then we have this long-winded fight sequence with 100 Agent Smiths. Essentially what happens is Agent Smith has learned how to assimilate others to be him. So whereas agents in the past, we see agents in the first film and in this film, can take on pretty much anybody in the Matrix because they're all code, right? So they can just latch onto that code and become that character. What Agent Smith has now discovered, but he can duplicate himself. So now that's how we have the ability for Neo to fight 100 Agent Smiths. It's like, okay, that's interesting. I just needed things to move along faster, and we kept slowing down for excessive fights, and I was just kind of not with it. I wasn't there for it, and I hadn't seen this movie in quite a while, so it took me to, it's like what I remembered of it, and then what it really was I felt the pacing was so off that I couldn't enjoy those moments that it wanted me to like really revel in and like look at all these cool things we can do, all that stuff, and I was just not there for it. So Oracle has told him he needs to get to the Keymaker. The Keymaker is hidden by one of the oldest programs out there, who is this kind of French underground dignitary, you know, and, you know, so we have this kind of, this has to play out, and that's where we lead to this excessive car chase, which then eventually leads us to the point of what we need to know, which is how Neo can confront the architect. And it's like the film had these bookends of plot, and that's what I wanted. And then there was all this time in the middle that I was not enjoying, that I lost interest. So all that to say, that's why I don't think Reloaded really still works. What does work about this film within the plot is this movie is showing us in the audience that this is the internal struggle. So this is how these people, these few rebels, are going to fight a war against these massive amounts of the machines, the Sentinels. Many of them don't believe in the whole prophecy, so they're not kind of rallied around the idea of like, oh, Neo's here, he's the one, he's going to save us, so they don't have that going for them. It's like an internal struggle between the governing council and the generals of the armies, that, you know, we can't put our faith in this just because Morpheus says this is the guy. We don't know if he is the guy. We don't know. We don't really, that doesn't help us here and now. So we have these kind of butting of heads of, do we follow Neo? Is that going to be enough? And just the point where we have to do it now, or we won't have any point to succeed. So there's millions of people underground, but it seems like it's the armies are few. In that beginning, Morpheus is part of the leaders who make these kind of massive declarations of war. So they're telling this kind of like throngs of people, all of the people of Zion, you know, we're ready, we can do this, we're still here, and we're gonna show them that we're not gonna die slaves. We're gonna save ourselves. So you have this huge kind of like moment of this massive, you know, speech from Morpheus, and then it instantly becomes a party. So you have the thousands of people, and this was another one I was surprised to find out. Really, they did have 1,000 extras, but they turn it into thousands, of course, and it turns into a rave, because that's, you know, we're primitive people of the future. We have our drums, but instantly, you know, it's a house party. And that rave eventually, you know, evolves into orgy. This is a primary issue I had with the movie in the theater. I'm like, I get it. It's the whole, we're all gonna die, so we might as well have a party. And I get that, but it just, that's another kind of like, okay, this is a long sequence as well. This is, like I say, where I feel this film has all kinds of timing problems, where it's like, okay, tighten this up. Didn't need to be as epic as the first one if you weren't going to have as epic of a story. And I also understand that it is the point of all of this, you know, this whole first half of the movie is essentially to kind of humanize it. It's important for the filmmakers to say these are real people who know what they're fighting. This is, you know, we have to make their cause real. You know, by making it real, that's why, you know, I guess it's this moment of ritual celebration of showing it's their last hurrah. You know, this is the, you know, for tomorrow we may die. So really, the first part is the story of Neo getting back to the Oracle. The Oracle sending him on a quest to find the Keymaker, and the Keymaker leading to his ultimate goal of the Architect. But all of that stuff in the middle is quite laborious to watch. Is kind of the word that came to my mind at this time. It's work to get to what we want to know. Every fight scene feels excessively long. The word I would use for the center of this film is overindulgent. That the filmmakers are doing this because they can. Not just because technically they can, you know, they're building the technology to make sure they can. They can, and they now have like the clout of the success of the first film to do what they want. And what they want is this massive action sequence. So it's I feel like this is more for them to show off. Like I said, I enjoy that tea house fight where we meet the Guardian, but I feel like that is the only fight in the film that has heart, if that makes sense. Maybe because it's two humans fighting, and the rest because Agent Smith has become this kind of unstoppable foe. It's too over the top, maybe. But yeah, that's between the car chase scene and all that. I really just felt like that was the tea house fight was the best moment of action in this film. Regardless of all of the information I took in about how they made all these sequences possible and all these different ways of filming and enhancing the abilities of wire techniques and all of these things, I still felt that this film comes across too reliant on CG, and that becomes the focus, is what can we do with CG. Again, it's kind of holding this film back for me. I feel like I'm watching cutscenes in a video game. Perhaps if they had tightened those scenes up, the film could have maybe lost a half hour at least, and the pacing issues I'm finding would have worked better to get me from the whole build up to going back to the Oracle to getting to the Architect. I needed all of that to kind of be faster to get there. I wanted that to happen. I did realize that in this film there seemed to be more of an emphasis in the dialogue to reference not just technology, but using computer terminology, particularly things that now may feel even a little dated. Even simple as using the word delete or copy. It's referencing software and coding. Copy, program, backdoor, delete, hard drive even seemed like... I watch a lot of science fiction, and there's a lot of technobabble in every Star Trek ever, but it felt like certain words had been like plopped in to be like, no, remember these are computer programs. That was a little bit more blatant in this one, and I didn't feel that in the first or actually in the third, so it was just in this film that I noticed that. It was interesting, like I said, in seeing how like that massive brawl with all the Agent Smiths, that there were actually, a massive amount of stuntmen with Agent Smith masks that were later kind of CG'd to be him. But still, it's impressive to watch the process, but I don't think there's a good enough payoff. Which could just be also, there's a movie made in 2003 with technology that in 2021 we are very used to, and it's commonplace now. Let's go back a little bit and see who's new to the cast when we get to this part of the series. Obviously, a big new character is by Jada Pickett Smith, Niobe. And we talked about Jada Pickett Smith back when I did the Scream sequels episode. Also, she was in, and I did a review in my Day in Life series of Demon Knight, which she was in. So it's really cool to see Jada Pickett Smith again. Henry Lennox, who was Commander Locke, has been in a lot of the DC Universe stuff. He was in Justice League, he was in Batman vs. Superman. So another person who's used to genre work now. Anthony Zerba, who was the Counselor. He was in the Omega Man, which was crazy going back that far. He was in the Dead Zone, Star Trek Insurrection. So here's definitely someone with a foot in genre work. Also lots of television work for him. It was also really interesting to see that on the Council, when we first see the Council, there was a very familiar face, a familiar gentleman, and I'm looking at it and I'm like, that's not an actor. Why is Cornel West in this film? So Cornel West, he's a professor and an author of theory. He writes about like race, class, and gender. So it was really interesting to see him in there. So that was a surprise. That harkens back to the fact that the Wachowskis, when they were first building this world, they wanted people to think about the philosophies behind things. So when you're talking about a rebel alliance that's getting prepared to kind of, have an insurgence against this kind of mechanical force that's, kind of their overlords, sure, someone who's going to talk about race, class, and gender might be a good person to have in the mix to discuss what are the ramifications of being kind of people who came from enslavement to their own freedom and now are fighting to keep their freedom and to free others outside of themselves. So that was interesting, kind of like little Easter eggish kind of thing, I guess you could say. So yeah, overall, I'm going to say though, Reloaded does not hold up very well. It is a middle. It happens. Which made me a little weary going into part 3, because I'm like, wow, I just remembered there was some cool stuff in this, but I couldn't really remember it separate from the third. So I'm like, oh man, am I not going to enjoy the third? That would be a bummer. But it turns out 3 is like all plot with action thrown in. But so I was relieved that like this was kind of more what I was looking for. This was the film that I wanted. But I don't think you could do one of those things where you skip part 2 to get right to this. And I think also I'm being very particular about what it is that I like. That, like I said, in saying that part 2 is not a successful film, to me is that's an individual concept. I'm not saying that most people won't enjoy this film. I'm saying it falls flat for me because I want story, I want character development, and I got parts of that, but there was too much spectacle for me to thoroughly enjoy. This film, I think, better balances all of those things. So we are now at the point where it is the war. So it's gone beyond starting it. Now we're in the throes of it. So, you know, when I was talking about the Alien series of films, we could say, you know, how they each fill each genre. I would say that The Matrix is kind of the hard sci-fi, that kind of cyberpunk neo-noir that we were discussing. The second one is an action film. It's a sci-fi action. And the third is a war film. This is definitely the kind of the sci-fi war movie that you need to end a trilogy like this. So, keeping in mind, this was shot the same time as the second one and all those other things, so they had 140 sets, like physical sets that they built on their sound stages. They had 5 stages, and it was all kind of going simultaneously because they had second AD, you know, they had like a secondary team filming at all times, and then you have kind of like your aside from just shooting pickup shots and action sequences, which are like explosions and things that second unit tends to do, you also had kind of other things being shot at the same time, and sets were constantly being broken down and restructured as they moved along quickly through all of the things they had to do. So keep that in mind. This is a film made while all these other things, all these moving parts, right, are going on at the same time. So that's impressive to me, how much this film kind of holds everything together, knowing that it was done at the same time. So I thought that was interesting to note. So again, 2003. This is Zion preparing for battle. They are ready to, pardon the pun, rage against the machines, as it were. Because of all of the things that happened to Neo at the end of the second film, he is in this kind of limbo state. He has not left the Matrix, but he's no longer jacked into the Matrix, so he's in kind of this purgatory. I really like the sequence that pertains to what this purgatory is, and it's instead of kind of the idea of the ferry boat, they use the metaphor of the subway station. So in that time, he also comes across but these are programs that are trying to leave, and these are the exiles, the programs that know but want no part of what's going on in the Matrix, and they want to kind of get to safety. In this film, we go back to the Oracle and the Guardian. They become a big part of this story as well. We see at this point, though, that the Oracle is not the same person. So we get a little Doctor Who-ish here, where the Oracle has moved on from one personage to another. It's explained in the story because she has helped Neo so much. She has kind of lost something of herself and has to take on a new form. In reality, unfortunately, the actress who played the Oracle so well in the first 2 films, great character, is Gloria Foster. She passes away before they get her parts in the third film. So what they do is they end up replacing her with the actress Mary Alice. Now, they had worked together on the stage for years, so the new actress Mary Alice was very aware of the kind of like the mannerisms and the movements of Foster. So it was a moment where they had to kind of figure out, how do we make this make sense in the story, and I think they do a good job. Growing up watching Doctor Who, and I think we're in a world where Doctor Who is a reference point, I think we are probably more accepting of these types of kind of shifts in physical bodies. So that's a big point in this film. So that's something that changes the game a little bit. Agent Smith has gone on from kind of assimilating others to make more, to basically copy and repeat himself over and over. But now he has also discovered a way into the Matrix. So we have a human who is essentially possessed by the agent in the real world, so not in the Matrix, but in the world of Zion, who's kind of a saboteur. So we have kind of these dual battles going on. I think probably another reason why I enjoy the action sequences in Revolutions better than in Reloaded is because we spend much less time in the Matrix, so there's much less need for those over-the-top, kind of over CG actions, because when they're in the real world, they don't have these powers. So I think that's why the action sequences move better for me. When we get to the point where Zion is defending themselves from the machines, literally, we get these kind of robot warrior suits, which is somewhere between kind of like Aliens, Ripley, and Robot Jocks, but heavily armed and with tons of machine guns. So those are some cool scenes, fighting down the, like shooting at the hordes and hordes of machines that are coming at them, the Sentinels. And yeah, I mean, they're definitely CG'd, but I don't know if there's even the time between it. It's 6 months more of prep time, but there's something about this CG that didn't bother me as much as in the last film. And it's also, it could just be the nature of it, because it's, as science fiction fans, we're used to seeing these kind of warring, structures. And like I said, I see a lot of the Alien films in this, particularly the kind of real world of the Matrix. And of course, this is the first time we're seeing the true size and scale of this Sentinel forces, and it's just literally thousands and thousands and thousands of them. So it's even though we have thousands of people in Zion, them versus these kind of like perfect fighting machines, of course, it's the small rebellion against the massive evil forces. This film also has moments of where, I mean, it's definitely throughout this trilogy, but I will say in this film it's much stronger that we have these moments of the kind of the Messiah complex, the idea that Neo is the Messiah, not just the one, but it is it's godlike. It gets far more Judeo-Christian at this point, where he is blinded, but he can see light. Once his eyes are gone out of the equation, Neo sees lights in kind of purities. And once he has kind of the full force behind him of all of his energy, it kind of emanates in this light of, it's a cross-like light. It's kind of hard to miss that. So he has this kind of angel-like persona at this point. The end battle, which is the kind of expected kind of confrontation, the final fight between Neo and Agent Smith at this point it is like the other fights, but this is the inevitable. You know it's coming. And we've seen now the scale of just how many Agent Smiths there are. There's hundreds of them. And in shooting this sequence, they literally had, I think it was like 80 stuntmen, over 100 dummies, like prop dummies, with all of them with these Agent Smith masks, and then enhance that with CG repetition. So it's just epic in scale. But it's funny because at this point I start thinking of it as he has assimilated all of them into being him, and he's almost Borg-like at this point, where they're kind of like a hive mentality. So that was interesting to me. I think this film, once you see more of the people of Zion, and the film before it, so that both of the sequels, there is an emphasis at this point of the future as, using like early 2000s terminology, as being this multicultural landscape. So there's a definite choice to make sure it's predominantly people of color once we get to Zion, which is a culmination of concepts. It is the idea that a lot of these barriers that we have don't have a reason to exist in the future. We're all at the same plane, so skin tone will have much less kind of dividing factors, and there's enough divisions between kind of those who are part of the cause, those who are not yet freed, this kind of reality of it being human versus machine being far more important than internal struggles of humanity against humanity. So it's this kind of utopian concept that we see. I mean, Star Trek has been doing this for generations now. The future is a world where we become one, essentially. And like I say, this is this utopian concept pushed further. And I think there's a definite, from the first film to now, where we get to the third film, I think it's far more, it has evolved and it has become more present. And it's discussed within the context of the interviews with the actors that this was important to them. Jada Pickett Smith at one point says this is the most people of color she's seen on the set of a science fiction film. That's important. We can see that these ideas of the struggle of humanity are still kind of talking about these same metaphors and concepts of freedom and you know, a necessary coming together of peoples. Other concepts that I think come through on these sequels, particularly in the third, is belief and faith. So is the faith in Neo that those close to him have that gets Neo to the point where he can have faith in himself. And that is important because it also leads to the idea of belief in things that go deeper than concrete evidence. So there's this ongoing debate between the kind of like war generals and Morpheus, who's one of them. He's a general. He has this strong belief that he has struggled to find the one, and this is the one. And they don't share that with him. But slowly, others start to see what Neo can do. Lawrence Fishburne at one point says how the trilogy of films are about love, life, and death, where the first film is about life and, you know, kind of the freedom of your life, claiming your life. The second is about love and how it is the kind of the faith that these people who love you have in you. And then the third film is about death. So it's a cycle. And I think that's very true. You can see that easily, that these films are showing you how important all of those stages are, and that death is part of that stage. Obviously, the war sequences at the time that this was made were the most intense CG sequences filmed in a film. Was it like thousands of gigs of information, hundreds of animators. So the CG was just the most intense at this point. But, like I said, I feel that it's the most kind of well articulated and believable. The final battle, there's discussion about how, since the final fight between Neo and Agent Smith happens in the rain, and how it was important for it to be in this heavy, heavy rainfall. And they kind of juxtaposing of the imagery of code, the Matrix itself is supposed to look like rain. So that's why the rain had to be so important and so intense in that particular fight scene. The fight escalates to the point where they're fighting in space, because they both, I mean, in the Matrix, they both have the ability to fly, so they have this kind of Superman versus Superman fight, you know, and there's interesting about how they work out the martial arts for that sequence through zero gravity planes, and what would it be like to move in zero gravity. And so going through that, it's like I said, it's these layers of complexity into organizing these fight scenes is impressive. But at that point, again, it goes back to looking like video games. There's a lot of discussion also about the evolution going from bullet time in the first to what they essentially consider not just mocap at this point, but what they use by the end, they're calling straight virtual cinematography. And that is all of the layers being recorded separate and then having the control, you know, digitally to place that camera wherever they want it to be. They talk about it in terms of how it's liberating the filmmaker from all the physical constraints of filmmaking. It's all great ideas, and it pushed us forward, and we wouldn't have some of the things that we take for granted now in filmmaking without it. But these capture me the least. It's more fascinating to me to learn about it than to watch it sometimes. So maybe that's it not aging well, but the kind of the history of it evolving is just as entertaining at some points. There's also not just evolving the technology in CG, but since they've now been working with wire techniques, with Yao Ping and kind of this kind of Hong Kong tradition, they're now at the point where in order to do those fight scenes where they're fighting while flying, fighting in space, they end up creating rigs that instead of just bringing you up and holding you up, can now twist and turn. So it's almost like a bolted to the side rig where the actors can kind of almost tumble together. Very fascinating, very interesting. Yeah, it's more it's more of this kind of process that's more entertaining than the results in this, because it's at this point where we've seen so much. It's like, yeah, so by now it could just be two cartoon characters, but the fact that they physically film them is still amazing. But I don't know if we feel it as being real. Like, I don't know if at the time I felt differently, but it felt, the term we use around here is it felt gamey. It felt like I was watching a game. So all that, I mean, there's so much technology used. That's really cool. That's really fascinating. But there's other aspects of the films that I think work. I mean, the costume designing is still amazing. The ability to kind of create the tones or the color palettes that separate the two worlds, the world in the Matrix, the world of reality, is still extremely important. The kind of intense use of design in the physical places of Zion and the ships that they all use, the aging of it, and the kind of the realness looking of that is just as impressive to me. The score music, I wanted to mention the score a little bit. At the end, there's this massive kind of choir, which I think is really impressive linked into the score, that it turns out the choir was singing in Sanskrit, which is just kind of like impressive and amazing in its own way, but it adds to this kind of godlike element of what we're seeing happening, the ascending of Neo and his abilities. The composer talks about how when getting the gig, he looked at it as, he scored the original Matrix, and then when found out that they were going to do the other two, instead of, there's certain things that the Wachowskis wanted from each film musically, but what he decided to do was to think of it more like it was all one massive composition with 3 movements. So that he wanted to see that there were tie-ins musically, film to film, which I think is important. The idea of themes in music is very important in how we tell stories. So it was interesting to hear him talk about that, and then of course his integration of the choir. And so it's this kind of traditional, even though it's in the more abstract sense or non-traditional classical sounds, but it's this traditional orchestration on top of still these layers of electronic music that I think are important to humanity and the machine and kind of the falseness of the Matrix. So all these layers sonically that I think add to it very well. One thing that I forgot to mention when I discussed the soundtrack of the first film is one of the kind of dominant creators of the kind of techno side of things, the electronica side of things, is the band Juno Reactor, and their music is very kind of throughout the whole trilogy. So that was interesting. Go back to when we talk about these kind of overall design factors, the importance not just of the Wachowskis' kind of vision of what they wanted everything to be, but the concept art of Jeff Darrow having such a huge impact on how these things look, particularly once we're in Zion. I think his kind of meticulous look and style is very important to what that becomes. Another thing I thought was interesting on the technology side of things was that there was a piece about the fact that all of the screens in the films really do have things on them, and that there was a whole team that just was doing in-house screen graphics throughout. And so when the people sitting at computers, or if you're the person controlling one of the ships and you're also monitoring the Matrix and you're monitoring the life signals of all of the kind of jacked in passengers you have, all of those things are happening in real time on those monitors. So there were people who were they had like rows of, at the time, VCRs and DVD players and hard drives and computers linked to all of these things, and guys underneath, like in a little control room, like a TV station, sending out those signals so that the actors could react to what was on the screen. That was really cool and very important. I think today we do a lot of things where we rely on CG for that, where we'll green screen out all the monitors. And just like when you have nothing for someone to act against, when you use CG environments in total green screen like that, not having things on the monitors is going to affect the way people look at them and the way that they act against them. So that's really important and cool that they were able to pull that off. I definitely appreciated that. There's also interesting that they had to talk about the fact that they had to utilize both green screen and blue screens depending on what world they were filming sequences for. Couldn't use blue screen, I believe, when you were in the real world because it had a blue hue to it. So too many things had blue that would interact with blue screen. And the same thing was true when they were in the Matrix. Everything had a green hue to it, so you couldn't use green screen there. So it's really cool how they had to take note of that in just the work that it's just massive. The massive scale of what they had to do to create all of these things is super impressive. So I mean, watching each movie was one thing, but then going back and watching all of the making ofs was just like so impressively overwhelming. It was almost like watching I have the kind of like true Star Wars, well, shouldn't say true. I have the full Star Wars Blu-ray box set that has all of the films. Well, it has the 6 films, I should say. But it has hours and hours and hours and hours of making up. And that was what this experience was like. Each of these had hours and hours and hours of extras. Like, they each had like a feature-length documentary, and then kind of like all these kind of mini, like featurettes about each different topic. And I will admit there was so much that when I got to the sequels, I found myself skipping the ones for the sequences I wasn't as interested in. I wasn't as interested in, obviously, those fight scenes I didn't care for, but I still saw parts of that in the overall documentary. So, all that to say, these are really impressive discs. I will say one negative about these discs was it was not easy to get to those menus because they had built-in autoplay feature. So when you would go to kind of build up the pop-up menu bar, it only wanted to ask you about, did you want to turn on the commentaries or any of the other in-movie extras. Getting to the actual extras, I found myself, if I didn't do it the same day as watching the film, I found myself having to go to the, like, letting it auto start, going to the last scene, fast forwarding through everything, like flipping through all of the channel, all of the tracks to get to the regular menu that'll pop up at the end. So, slight issue with the manufacturing setup of these, but nonetheless, impressive amounts of information on both. If you want to learn how modern filmmaking works, yeah, you need this. Okay, so that was a lot of information, all of it to say the Matrix Trilogy as a whole, I do believe holds up. This as a trilogy holds up, and is the first film is particularly still a classic and a perfect film. The sequels, I feel, suffer from pacing. Perhaps, maybe, I feel like this maybe could have been 2 films instead of 3. There's still a lot of story to tell. If part of maybe 3 could have, I don't know how you would have changed it, but maybe all of my problems have more to do with pacing than anything else, because it's impressive and it's epic. And that's what you want from science fiction. You want science fiction to be epic. I mean, that's what I want from science fiction. So I'm going to say I do recommend Where I'm going to say that I'm probably very individual in not enjoying the second one as much. I think most people enjoyed the second one more than the third one, from what I remember, and from, when I still had cable. The second one was on TV all the time, which is why, that was another thing I want to mention. I don't own 2 and 3 before I bought this Blu-ray set, because they were on TV all the time. I never bothered picking up the discs. So now that I have them, and time has passed, and I've had a good decade without cable, if not more. Wait, I've had like about 15 years without cable. So that's about how long it's been since I've watched all 3. I'm going to say overall, I still vastly enjoy the world that the Wachowskis create in these films. Yes, number one, foremost, will always be the technical achievements created in these films. I will say that the deep use of metaphor for fighting for freedoms, for individuality, and the importance of finding yourself and fighting for being yourself are very important in these films. So those deep-rooted kind of, also these kind of theories of the importance, and it sounds hokey, but it's so old school in its traditional kind of messages of the importance of love and hope and faith, but it doesn't have to be, like I say, they do hearken up these kind of very traditional Judeo-Christian concepts, but or Judeo-Christian imagery, but I don't think that it is particularly hearkening on of a particular faith. I think it's more the idea that you need to have faith in something. The fact that the importance of concepts like oracles and even the architect, so the architect being this kind of central figure who is the creator of the code, the one that keeps the Matrix running, the one that knows it created the source code. So the architect being the central being, like the God, where the oracle maybe is the kind of interpreter of the potential of God to the people. All of this plays on mythologies, it plays on fairy tales, it plays on, I mean, you have kind of like this Campbell-esque hero's journey, you have the Odyssey and the Iliad all rolled up together in philosophies and concepts that bring all of it in a way to make you understand the importance of expanding who you are and finding the real you. That is the important message of all of this in the Matrix films and the Matrix trilogies, is the idea to free your mind and be you. So with that, I'm going to say, I recommend doing it. Do the trilogy. Check it out. Go through the whole thing again. See if you agree with me. See if maybe I'm being too meticulous about what we come to expect in our CG today and not getting past it. And maybe I'm not an action film person, so maybe that's why part 2 didn't appeal to me as much. All of it is excellent science fiction, and like I said, I know that this is the version I have. This is the Blu-ray set. There is an American edition, which was out of print. Here's the UK edition that I have today. I do know in stores now is the 4K version, which I'm going to assume has a lot of the same stuff. Might even have some more, because it might have some stuff about the new movie that I have yet to see. So by the time you guys watch this, I will have most likely seen the movie, and I don't know, maybe we'll have a discussion about it at some point. But I wanted to make sure that I gave proper time and energy to a modern classic trilogy. And I will say, when The Matrix came out in 1999, it was an instant classic. So I hope you enjoyed my look back on the Matrix series. Let me know what you think. Let me know, do they hold up for you? I will next time be looking at one last Italian horror film for that series. I will see you then. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time on the Horror Academic.